can't. I can't lose this. You must, or everything will be lost.
What would you give up to protect a secret that could either save the man you love or send you both to the gallows? Would you stay silent while the truth burns a hole through your chest? Or would you speak, even if speaking meant losing everything? Some secrets are small enough to carry quietly for a lifetime. Others grow heavier with every year they are kept, until one day they demand to be set down, whether or not the world is ready to receive them. This is a story about a woman who buried her name so deep she nearly forgot the sound of it herself, and a man whose entire inheritance depended on never asking the questions that would eventually save them both. Keep that question in your mind as you watch. By the end of the story, you will have your own answer. The sun had not fully risen over Ashmere Hall when the screaming started. Not a woman's scream. A horse. In the stable yard, a black stallion named Ferrox reared so high his front hooves scraped the morning sky. 3 grown men lay in the mud around him, one clutching a broken arm, another too dazed to stand. Grooms pressed themselves against the fence rails, afraid to move closer. Duke Damien Ashworth stood at the gate with a pistol in his hand and a jaw carved from stone. He had buried his father 6 months ago. He would not bury another good man because of a horse no one could tame. "Clear the yard," he said. "I will not lose another hand to this animal." From the hayloft above, a girl in a boy's oversized coat watched everything. Her name was Wren Calloway, and she had been mucking stalls at Ashmere Hall for 11 months, speaking to no one more than she had to. She watched the Duke raise the pistol. She watched the stallion's eyes roll white with terror, not rage. She knew that look. She had seen it once before on a different horse, in a life she was not allowed to remember. She climbed down before she let herself think twice. She did not sleep that night. She sat awake listening to Ferrox shift and breathe in the stall beside her narrow cot, replaying the moment the Duke had lowered his pistol, wondering how many more mornings she could walk through Ashmere Hall before someone looked past the dirt on her face and saw the resemblance she worked so hard to bury. A name whispered to a horse should have meant nothing to anyone else. She was beginning to understand it might mean everything. Word of what happened in the stable yard spread through Ashmere Hall before breakfast was served. By noon, half the household staff had invented their own version of the story. Some said the stable girl practiced witchcraft. Others said she had simply been lucky. Damien did not believe in luck. He found Wren in the far stall, brushing Ferrox with slow, even strokes, humming something low under her breath. She stopped the moment she noticed him in the doorway. "You froze him," Damien said. 3 trainers from the capital could not get near that horse. "You said one word and he knelt like a lamb." "He was frightened, Your Grace," Wren said, keeping her eyes down. "Frightened animals need a voice they trust. That is all." "He has never heard your voice before today." "He has heard the word before." She kept brushing. "Some words carry weight a stranger cannot fake." Damien studied her for a long moment, unconvinced, but unwilling to press further with grooms listening from the aisle. He had learned, in the 6 months since his father's death, that pressing too hard in front of an audience rarely produced honest answers, only rehearsed ones. Whatever this girl was hiding, and he was now certain she was hiding something, it would take patience to uncover, not orders barked across a stable aisle. He simply nodded and told her Ferrox was now her sole responsibility, day and night, and that she would be moved from the outer barn to the quarters nearer the main house so she could tend the animal at all hours. Wren's stomach dropped. Nearer the main house meant nearer to eyes that might recognize her. Nearer to the very family whose name had once been spoken alongside her father's in whispers of treason. But refusing the Duke's order would only draw more attention. so she bowed her head and accepted. The head groom, a weathered man named Baxter who had worked the Ashworth stables since before Damien was born, pulled her aside once the Duke had gone. "You have a gift, girl, whatever it is," he said, not unkindly. "But gifts like that get noticed in houses like this one. Noticing is not always safe." He said nothing more, only pressed a spare blanket into her arms and walked away, leaving Wren to wonder how much the old groom had already guessed, and how many more people at Ashmere Hall might be watching her more closely than she realized. That night, alone in the new quarters with a single candle burning, Wren allowed herself to remember. She thought of her father, a decorated cavalry colonel who taught his men and his horses to answer only to a chosen word, a private signal no enemy could imitate. She thought of the night soldiers came for him, dragging him away on charges of treason he never committed, charges built on forged letters she later learned were paid for by a rival family desperate to seize her father's land and title. She thought of her mother, who died of a broken heart within the year, and of the flower her mother had grown in their garden every spring. Amaranth, the flower that does not wilt. Her mother named it the family's secret word before Wren even understood what secrets were for. She was 8 years old when she lost everything. She was 19 now, hiding in a Duke's stable, and the one word she had left of her family had just pulled her directly into the light she swore she would never step into again. She thought, too, of the years between, the years no one at Ashmere Hall would ever hear about. A distant aunt who took her in only long enough to sell her father's remaining horses. A convent school that turned her out the moment the coin ran dry. Farms and kitchens and stable yards across 3 counties, each one a little closer to forgetting who she used to be. She had told herself, every single time she moved on, that survival mattered more than memory. Yet here she stood, in the one house she should have fled the moment she learned its name, because a dying stallion had reminded her too much of the mare her father once rode into battle, and she had not been able to walk away. Ferrox pressed his nose against her shoulder as if he understood, and for a moment, that was enough. 3 days later, the household prepared for an afternoon visit from Lady Josephine Vane, and Wren spent the morning polishing tack she had already cleaned twice, grateful for any task that kept her far from the main house while the family entertained. It did not last. The housekeeper found her by midday and handed her a stack of pressed linens with instructions to deliver them to the parlor closet before the guests settled in for tea. Wren carried the tray of linens past the parlor when she heard Lady Josephine Vane's voice rise sharp and urgent behind the heavy oak door. She should have kept walking. She did not. "The wedding contract was signed by your father and mine before either of us could object," Josephine said. "I do not intend to wait another season while you play with horses and forget your obligations, Damien." "I have not forgotten anything," Damien answered, his voice tight and controlled. "My father's debts to your family will be settled. That was the agreement. The agreement was marriage, not merely money." Pause, softer now, calculating. "Unless there is some other reason you have grown so distracted lately. I hear the new stable hand has quite a gift." Wren's hand tightened around the tray until her knuckles went pale. She pressed herself against the wall, out of sight, and listened as Damien's answer came slow and careful. "The stable hand has a gift with horses. Nothing more. See that it stays nothing more," Josephine said. "I did not survive my own father's schemes to be humiliated by a girl who mucks stalls." Wren slipped away before either of them could open the door. Her heart pounded the entire walk back to the barn, not from fear of being caught, but from the words she could not stop turning over. Josephine's father had schemes. Josephine had survived them. And somewhere behind that careful, glittering smile, Wren sensed a woman who understood exactly how far her family would go to protect their position. She did not yet know how close that suspicion sat to the truth. For the rest of that afternoon, Wren found herself watching Josephine from a careful distance whenever their paths crossed near the main house, studying the way she smiled at the servants and the way that smile vanished the instant she believed no one important was watching. It reminded Wren of something she had not let herself think about in years: the careful masks worn by every noble family she had once known, her own included, before the world decided which masks were allowed to remain and which were torn away by force. She wondered, not for the first time, what mask Josephine wore over whatever fear or grief lived beneath her polish, and whether anyone had ever bothered to ask. That evening, Ferrox nudged her shoulder as she filled his water trough, and for the first time in 11 months, Wren allowed herself to cry, quiet and controlled, the way her mother had taught her to grieve without ever showing the world she was broken. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve before anyone could see, and told herself the tears were only for the horse, only for the ache in her arms after a long day of work. It was easier than admitting the truth, that hearing Lady Josephine speak so freely of schemes and survival had cracked something open in her, a longing she had buried alongside her parents'. She wanted, just once, to stop calculating every glance and every word. She wanted a room where she did not have to disappear the moment someone looked at her too closely. She did not yet allow herself to wonder whether that room might exist somewhere inside Ashmere Hall, in the quiet company of a man who had not once treated her like a girl to be dismissed. Sleep did not come easily to Damien most nights. He often walked the grounds past midnight, checking on the horses himself rather than trusting the task to anyone else. It was a habit left over from his father, who had taught him that a true leader checks on what he claims to care for, especially when no one is watching. He heard singing before he reached the stable door. Wren sat on an overturned crate beside Ferrox's stall, her cap removed, dark curls loose around her face, singing softly in a language Damien did not recognize at first, until he realized it was simply an old lullaby sung low and slow. Her voice was clear, warm, nothing like the clipped, careful tone she used during the day. He stood in the shadows and did not announce himself, though he knew he should have. Something about the moment felt too honest to interrupt. Ferrox's ears flicked toward him before Wren's did. She turned, startled, and scrambled to pull her cap back over her hair. "Your Grace, I did not hear you," she said quickly. "You sing beautifully," Damien said, before he could stop himself. Wren said nothing, her cheeks warm despite the cold night air. "Where did you learn that song?" "My mother, Your Grace." The answer came out before she could soften it into something safer. "A long time ago." Damien wanted to ask more. He wanted to ask why a stable girl carried herself the way she did, why her hands, though calloused now, still moved with the grace of someone trained in etiquette she should have no reason to know. He wanted to ask why Ferrox, an animal that had injured 6 grown men, rested his head against her chest like she was the only safe place left in the world. Instead, he simply said goodnight and walked back toward the house, more unsettled than he had been in months. Somewhere beneath his ribs, a question had planted itself, and he suspected it would not leave him alone until he found the answer. Wren watched him go from the stable doorway, her heart still racing though the danger, if there had ever truly been any, had already passed. She pressed her palm flat against Ferrox's warm neck and exhaled slowly, furious with herself for singing loud enough to be overheard, furious with herself for the small, foolish part of her that had not minded being caught at all. She had built her entire survival on the discipline of never being seen fully by anyone. Standing there in the quiet dark, she understood for the first time how tired she had grown of that discipline, and how dangerous it would be to let that tiredness win. He did not go straight to bed. He sat in his study long after the candles burned low, staring at the dying fire rather than the papers waiting on his desk, turning over every small detail he had gathered about the stable hand called Elias. It struck him as strange how much space one quiet, guarded stranger had come to occupy in his thoughts over the span of a few short weeks, when he had spent the better part of a year barely noticing the noblewoman he was contracted to marry. The way she measured feed with exact precision, never wasting a single handful. The way she flinched at the sound of raised voices from the main house, as though old instinct warned her to disappear before trouble found her. The way she had once corrected a visiting lord's Latin without meaning to, then caught herself and fell silent for the rest of the evening. None of it added up to the daughter of a common farmer, which was the story written in the stable ledger beside her name. Damien did not yet have a better story to replace it with, but he intended to find one, and something in him, something he refused to name that night, hoped the truth would give him a reason to keep her close rather than send her away. A week later, Damien announced he would ride out to inspect the northern pastures and insisted Wren accompany him, since Ferrox refused every other handler and the Duke wanted the stallion tested on open ground. The ride began calm enough, the autumn sky pale gold above the hills. Ferrox moved beneath Wren with an ease he had never shown any other rider, responding to the smallest shift of her weight, the quietest word from her lips, and for the first stretch of the journey, Damien found himself watching the two of them together more than he watched the road ahead. There was something in the sight that unsettled him pleasantly, a partnership between rider and horse that no amount of training alone could produce. It had to be trust, earned rather than taught, and he wondered how long it had taken her to build that kind of trust with anyone, animal or otherwise. By mid-afternoon, storm clouds rolled in faster than either of them expected, and rain came down in sheets that turned the path to mud within minutes. Damien led them to an abandoned stone cottage half a mile off the trail, the only shelter for miles. Inside, the cottage held one dry room, a cold hearth, and barely enough space for 2 people and 2 horses tied beneath the small covered porch outside. "We waited out," Damien said, wringing water from his sleeve. He winced, favoring his left shoulder, injured when his horse had slipped on the wet stone earlier. Wren noticed immediately. "Let me see it. It is nothing. It is not nothing if you cannot lift your arm." She was already moving toward him before her mind caught up with her body, unwrapping the makeshift bandage the ride had loosened. Her fingers worked with practiced calm, the same calm she used with frightened animals, and Damien found himself watching her face instead of his own shoulder. "You have done this before," he said. "My father taught me. Soldiers and horses both need someone who knows how to tend a wound without panicking. Your father was a soldier." Wren's hands stilled for half a breath before she resumed her work. "He was." Damien did not push further, though the answer only deepened the question living in his chest. The rain continued outside, and for a long while neither of them spoke, the small room filled only with the sound of the storm and the closeness neither one acknowledged aloud. When their eyes finally met, something passed between them that had nothing to do with wounded shoulders or wild horses, something neither of them was ready to name. "We should not linger on this," Damien said quietly, though he made no move to step back. "No," Wren agreed, though she made no move either. The storm broke before either of them broke first, and they rode back to Ashmere Hall in silence, both carrying a truth they were not yet brave enough to speak. Before they mounted their horses again, Damien had gathered dry kindling from a shelf near the hearth and coaxed a small fire to life, more out of habit than necessity, since the rain had already begun to ease. Wren watched the flames catch and thought of her father's campfires, of nights spent listening to soldiers' trade stories, while her mother mended uniforms by lantern light. She had not allowed herself those memories in years, yet sitting across from Damien in that narrow stone room, they came easily, gently, without the grief that usually followed them. "You are somewhere else," Damien said quietly, watching her face in the firelight. "I am remembering," Wren admitted, before she could stop herself. Good memories, for once. Damien did not ask her to explain. He simply let the silence hold both of them a while longer, grateful, though he could not have said why, that some part of her was finally willing to let him see it. When the rain finally eased enough to travel, Damien helped her onto her horse with a steadiness in his hands that lingered a moment longer than necessary, and neither of them commented on it. They rode the last stretch back to Ashmere Hall side by side rather than the usual careful distance of Duke and servant, the muddy fields turning gold again as the storm clouds broke apart over the hills. Wren caught herself smiling at nothing in particular, and when she noticed Damien watching her do it, she did not look away as quickly as she once might have. Ashmere Hall hosted a formal dinner the following week, gathering nobility from across the county to discuss the upcoming Ascot exhibition, where Damien intended to present Ferrox before the king himself as proof the Ashworth line still commanded respect and skill. Candlelight filled the grand hall by early evening, chandeliers glittering above long tables set with silver and crystal, the kind of gathering Wren had once attended as a guest rather than a servant, back when her family's name still opened doors instead of closing them. She had almost forgotten how loud a room full of nobility could sound, all clipped laughter and careful ambition. Every sentence weighed twice before it left anyone's mouth. She kept her eyes on the wine and her back straight and told herself, as she had told herself countless times before, that she was simply a girl pouring drinks, nothing more, nothing anyone in that glittering room had reason to remember by morning. Wren was pressed into service pouring wine, an order from the housekeeper that left no room for refusal. She kept her head down, moving quietly along the long table, until a voice near the center of the room stopped her heart cold. "Lord Reginald Vane," the butler announced, "and his daughter, Lady Josephine." Wren had not seen Reginald Vane's face in 11 years, not since the night he stood in the shadows of the courtroom that condemned her father, smiling faintly while forged letters were read aloud as proof of treason that never existed. He looked older now, heavier, but his eyes still held the same cold satisfaction she remembered from her nightmares. Her hand shook as she reached his glass. The decanter slipped, crystal striking the table edge, wine spreading dark across the white linen. "Careless girl," someone muttered. Damien was there before the words finished leaving the guest's mouth, catching Wren's wrist gently before she could reach for the broken glass with bare fingers. "Leave it," he said, low enough for only her to hear. "You will cut yourself." His thumb brushed briefly across the back of her hand, and for one unguarded second, he noticed how soft her palm was beneath the calluses, how her hands trembled not from clumsiness but from something closer to fear. He said nothing in front of the guests, but the observation lodged itself firmly in his mind, another piece of a puzzle he was determined to finish. Across the table, Reginald Vane watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, and beside him, Josephine's polite smile did not reach the calculation building behind her gaze. Wren excused herself as soon as she could, disappearing into the kitchen corridor, pressing her back against the cold stone wall, breathing hard. The past she had buried for 11 years had just sat down at the Duke's dinner table, close enough to recognize her if she made one more careless mistake. She counted her own breaths the way her mother once taught her, in through 4 counts, out through 6, until her hands stopped shaking enough to carry a tray again. Through the corridor wall, she could still hear fragments of the dinner conversation, Reginald Vane's voice rich with false warmth as he praised the Duke's plans for Ascot, Josephine's laughter arriving a half-second too late to sound sincere. Wren pressed her palm flat against the stone and made herself a promise. She would finish her work that night without a single mistake, and she would find a way, however small, to learn what Reginald Vane truly wanted from Ashmere Hall before he learned anything at all about her. She did not yet know that the Duke himself had already begun that same search, 3 steps ahead of her, in a locked drawer inside his private study. Damien found her later that night in the library, not by accident. He had been searching the estate records for weeks, ever since the word Amaranth first left her lips in the stable yard, a word he recognized from his own father's private correspondence with a cavalry colonel long thought guilty of treason. He had spent 3 nights combing through his father's old letters, boxes of them, tied with ribbon and stored in a locked cabinet no one had opened since the funeral, searching for a name to match the word, and searching for a face to match the name once he found it. When he finally found the correspondence he needed, dated some 12 years earlier, his father's handwriting confirmed everything Damien had begun to suspect. He closed the cabinet, poured himself nothing to steady his nerves, and walked straight to the library, where he knew Wren often stayed late, tending to her own quiet grief among the books no one else in the house cared to read. "Colonel Edmund Calloway," Damien said, closing the door behind him. Wren went perfectly still. "My father wrote to him for years before the trial." Amaranth was the signal word Calloway used to identify loyal men within his unit, men who would not betray each other even under threat of death. Damien stepped closer. "My father believed him innocent, Wren. He believed the letters used against Calloway at trial were forged, but he could never prove it before Calloway was executed." "He was murdered," Wren said, her voice breaking for the first time since Damien had known her. "Not executed. Murdered by lies paid for by a man who wanted his land and his title. Reginald Vane." Wren's eyes lifted to his, full of 11 years of grief she had never allowed anyone to witness. "You already knew. I suspected the moment you spoke that word. I confirmed it tonight, watching your hands shake at a dinner table across from the man responsible for your father's death." Damien reached into a drawer and withdrew a leather journal, worn and half-burned at the edges. "My father kept half of this before he died. He believed it could clear your father's name, but the pages were encoded in a cipher only Calloway's family would recognize." Wren took the journal with trembling hands, tracing the burned edge, recognizing her father's handwriting beneath the damage. "I am not simply a stable girl to you now," she said quietly. "You were never simply a stable girl," Damien answered. "You are Lady Wren Calloway, daughter of a man my family failed to save, and I intend to help you finish what he started." "Why would you risk everything for me?" Wren asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your engagement, your family's alliance with the Vanes, all of it. For a girl who lied to you for months? Because you did not lie to survive out of cruelty," Damien said. "You lied because the people who should have protected your family failed you completely, mine included. I cannot undo what happened 11 years ago. I can make certain it does not happen again." For the first time since arriving at Ashmere Hall, Wren allowed herself to believe she was not entirely alone. She sat with the journal pressed against her chest long after Damien left the library that night, tracing the burned edge with her thumb, half expecting the pages to dissolve into smoke the moment she looked away. 11 years of silence had taught her to distrust anything that felt like relief. Yet here it was regardless, settling into her chest slow and unfamiliar, like sunlight through a window she had long assumed was painted shut. She thought of her father's steady hands teaching her the cipher as a girl, never once explaining why it mattered, only that it might, someday. She understood now what he had known all along, that the truth rarely announces itself. It waits, patient and quiet, for someone willing to carry it long enough to bring it into the light. Over the following weeks, Damien and Wren worked in secret, meeting in the library long after the household slept, decoding her father's journal page by page. The cipher relied on the very words Colonel Calloway once used to identify his loyal men, and Wren's memory of her father's teachings proved the key neither of them expected. Page by page, the truth emerged. Reginald Vane had forged the treasonous letters himself, paying a disgraced clerk to imitate Calloway's handwriting. He had done it to seize the northern territories bordering his own estate, land that fell to the crown after Calloway's conviction and was later sold, quietly, into Vane's hands at a price far below its worth. Each decoded page cost Wren something to read. Her father's private thoughts filled the margins between the cipher, worries about his men, plans for her upbringing, small notes about her mother's garden that had nothing to do with treason or land at all. She found herself pausing often, not because the cipher grew harder to solve, but because grief kept rising faster than she could work through it. Damien never rushed her during those pauses. He simply waited, refilling her tea, keeping the fire lit, understanding without being told that some silences needed to be honored rather than filled. "He loved you very much," Damien said quietly one night, reading over her shoulder as she translated a passage describing her 9th birthday, a party her father had apparently spent 3 weeks planning down to the smallest detail. Wren did not trust her voice enough to answer. She simply nodded, and let the warmth of his presence beside her fill in the space words could not reach. "He did all of this for land," Wren said one night, staring at the final decoded page. "My father died so that man could expand his borders." "He will answer for it," Damien said. "But we need proof strong enough to stand before the king, not simply a burned journal and a stable girl's memory." Vane has spent 11 years building his reputation on this lie. "Then we take it to Ascot," Wren said, "in front of the king and every noble family in the county. There will be nowhere for him to hide." Damien studied her, something like admiration warming his sharp features. "You sound like a woman raised to command a room, not muck a stable." "I was raised to survive," Wren said. "Command comes second." Their late-night meetings, born of necessity, had slowly become something neither of them planned. In the quiet hours, dropping every disguise between them, Damien saw not a stable girl but a woman who had carried impossible grief with more strength than most men he commanded. Wren saw not a duke bound by duty but a man willing to risk his family's alliance with the Vanes for the sake of a truth that cost him nothing to ignore. Neither said the word love aloud. Neither needed to. It lived quietly in every stolen glance across the library table, in every moment their hands brushed while turning brittle, burned pages. But secrets rarely stay buried forever. 3 nights before the household departed for Ascot, Josephine Vane saw Wren slipping out of the Duke's private study well past midnight, and her calculating mind began assembling a very different, very dangerous story of her own. Josephine had not gone looking for trouble that night. She had simply been unable to sleep, restless with the same unease that had followed her since the wine glass shattered at dinner, since she noticed the way Damien's eyes lingered a beat too long on a stable hand who should have meant nothing to him. She told herself she imagined it. She told herself the same thing again when she saw the study door open in the dark and a familiar shape slipped out, cap pulled low, moving with the careful quiet of someone who knew exactly how to avoid being seen. Josephine did not call out. She simply watched, memorizing the hour, the direction, the tremor of candlelight beneath the door before it closed again, and decided that whatever her father discovered from this information, she would make certain it worked in her favor and not against it. Josephine did not confront Wren directly. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she wrote to her father that same night, describing what she had seen, and Reginald Vane understood immediately what it meant. If Damien had found Calloway's journal, If the stable girl truly was the colonel's daughter, then everything he had built over 11 years stood one exposed truth away from collapse. He could not allow the Ascot exhibition to happen cleanly. A public unraveling before the king would cost him not only his stolen lands but very likely his freedom, and Reginald Vane had never once in his life allowed another man's success to threaten his own. He sent word that same night to a groom he had once employed and later dismissed for theft, a man desperate enough for coin to accept an assignment he did not ask too many questions about. 2 nights before the household departed, that stranger slipped into Ashmere Hall's stable under cover of darkness and mixed a bitter root known to drive horses into violent, uncontrollable frenzy directly into Ferrox's evening feed. It would not show symptoms immediately. It would wait, patient as poison always does, until the stallion stood before the king with the Duke on his back. Wren noticed something wrong the following morning. Ferrox's eyes carried a faint redness that had not been there before, and he flinched from her touch in a way he had not done in weeks. "Something is wrong with him," she told Damien, urgency sharpening her voice. "His eyes, his temperament, it is not like him." "He is likely nervous about the journey," Damien said, distracted by preparations for Ascot, by the weight of presenting his family's honor before the king in 3 days' time. Wren did not believe it, but with no proof beyond instinct, and with the household staff dismissing her concerns as a stable girl's nerves, she had no way to delay the departure. She spent that final night before Ascot brushing Ferrox slowly, whispering reassurance she did not entirely feel herself, watching for any sign of what she feared was coming. She did not yet know how right her instincts were, or how close she stood to losing everything a second time. Long after the household had gone quiet, Wren returned to the stable a second time, unable to shake the unease sitting heavy in her stomach. She checked Ferrox's feed bin by lantern light, sniffing the grain, running it through her fingers, searching for anything out of place, though she did not know what a bitter root smelled like mixed into oats and molasses. She found nothing certain, only a faint, unfamiliar sharpness beneath the usual sweetness, gone as quickly as she noticed it. She told herself it was likely nothing. She told herself that twice more before she finally returned to her cot, and neither time did she believe it. In the morning, the traveling carriages were already being loaded, and there was no more time left to wonder. She tried once more to voice her concerns, catching Damien alone beside the carriage as trunks were carried past them in both directions. "Please," she said, lowering her voice so none of the staff would hear, "delay the ride at Ascot, even by a day. Have another handler examine him first, someone with no stake in whether he performs well. The king is expecting the Ashworth stallion at midday tomorrow," Damien said gently, resting a hand briefly on her shoulder. A delay now, without solid proof, would look like weakness in front of every noble family who already doubts whether this house has recovered from my father's death. "I trust your instincts, Wren, more than you know. But I need more than instinct to change course this close to Ascot." Wren nodded, though the unease in her chest only deepened as the carriage door closed. She had learned long ago that instinct rarely lied, and she spent the entire journey to Ascot praying, for the first time in 11 years, that this once it finally would. The Ascot exhibition grounds overflowed with nobility from across the kingdom, banners snapping in the wind, the king himself seated in the royal box above the ring. Carriages lined the outer field for as far as the eye could see, and the air carried the mingled scent of trampled grass, roasted chestnuts, and the particular nervous energy of a crowd that had heard rumors of an untamable stallion and came hoping to see whether those rumors were true. Wren had spent the morning grooming Ferrox with more care than she had ever given him, brushing his coat until it gleamed like polished coal, braiding his mane with hands that would not quite stop shaking. She told herself the tremor came from the crowd, from the noise, from the sheer size of the occasion. She did not let herself say aloud what she truly feared, that the faint sharpness she had noticed in his feed 2 nights earlier had not been nothing at all. Damien rode out on Ferrox to a swell of applause, the Ashworth name once again standing proud before the crown. Wren watched from the rail, forbidden from standing closer, a groom's place and nothing more in the eyes of the crowd around her. She watched Ferrox's stride grow uneven halfway through the ring, watched his ears pin back, watched the same wild whiteness bloom in his eyes that she had seen the very first morning she stepped between him and Damien's pistol. "Something is wrong," she said, pushing toward the rail. A guard blocked her path. "Get back, girl. The Duke is presenting for the king." Ferrox reared without warning, a violent, terrified motion that threw Damien hard onto the packed dirt of the ring. The crowd gasped as the stallion spun, hooves striking wildly, and Damien struggled to rise, one arm pinned beneath him from the fall. Wren did not wait for permission. She vaulted the rail, tore the cap from her head, and ran into the ring as gasps turned to shouts of alarm around her. "Ferrox!" Her voice rang clear and unguarded across the entire grounds, nothing like the quiet, careful tone she had used for 11 months. "Amaranth!" The stallion froze mid-motion, front legs coming down slowly, ears turning toward the voice he trusted above every other sound in the world. He walked to her, trembling, and lowered his great head against her shoulder exactly as he had the very first morning, while hundreds of nobles and the king himself watched a stable girl calm a beast that had just thrown a duke to the ground. Damien rose, dust and blood on his sleeve, staring at her standing in the center of the ring, disguise gone, dark curls loose in the wind. No longer a servant but a woman the entire kingdom was about to recognize. "She is Lady Wren Calloway," Damien announced, his voice carrying across the stunned silence of the crowd. "Daughter of Colonel Edmund Calloway, wrongfully executed 11 years ago for a treason he never committed. I hold proof of the man responsible for that lie, and he stands among us today." Every eye in the crowd turned toward Reginald Vane, whose face had drained of all color, whose daughter beside him had gone rigid with the sudden, sickening understanding that her own letter had set this entire unraveling into motion. For one long moment, no one in the royal box moved. The king himself leaned forward, studying the stable girl standing calm and unshaken beside a stallion that had just thrown a duke to the ground, and the silence stretched thin enough that Wren could hear her own heartbeat over the wind snapping the banners above the ring. She had spent 11 years disappearing into corners, learning the exact art of being overlooked. Standing there in the center of Ascot, fully seen for the first time since she was 8 years old, she realized the fear she always imagined would accompany that moment simply was not there. In its place sat something steadier, something close to relief. Damien crossed the distance between them without a second thought for what the crowd might say, and took her hand in front of the entire kingdom, an answer to a question neither of them had ever spoken aloud. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some scandalized, some strangely moved, as the story spread from row to row faster than any herald could have announced it. A duke, holding the hand of a stable girl revealed as a wrongfully disgraced colonel's daughter, standing over the very man responsible for her family's ruin. It was the sort of moment nobility would speak of for seasons afterward, embellishing it a little more with every retelling, though none of the embellishments would ever need to improve upon what had actually happened in that ring. Reginald Vane did not run. There was nowhere left to run to, not with the king himself demanding the journal be read aloud before the entire royal box. Damien presented the decoded pages, and Wren stood beside him, her voice steady now, describing the cipher her father had taught her as a child, a code no forger could have known to imitate. The clerk who had forged the original letters, located within the week by the Duke's own men, confirmed everything under oath, terrified enough of the king's justice to protect no one but himself. He described in detail the sum he had been paid, the study where the forgery had taken place, and the exact phrases Reginald Vane had instructed him to imitate from Colonel Calloway's genuine correspondence. It took less than an hour for the royal court to reach its judgment. Reginald Vane was stripped of his title and his stolen lands that very season, the Northern Territories restored to the Calloway name by royal decree. Josephine Vane, who had written the letter that set her father's downfall in motion without ever meaning to, disappeared from society entirely. Her engagement to Damien dissolved the moment the truth of her family became known. She left Ashmere Hall on a quiet morning, no fanfare, no farewell, only the quiet understanding that some debts, once uncovered, can never be repaid. Wren felt no satisfaction watching the Vane carriage disappear down the long drive for the final time. She had spent too many years learning what it cost to lose a family's name to take pleasure in watching another family lose theirs, even one built on lies. What she felt instead was something quieter, a loosening in her chest she had carried so long she had forgotten it counted as a weight at all. The people responsible for her father's death would answer for it under the king's law, not by her own hand, not through a bitterness she would have to carry for the rest of her life. That, she decided, was its own kind of justice, the kind that let her finally rest. Weeks later, the gardens at Ashmere Hall bloomed with amaranth flowers planted along the eastern wall. A quiet tribute Damien commissioned without telling Wren until the first blooms opened. She found him standing beside them one morning, his shoulder healed, his family's honor restored alongside her own. "You did not have to do this," she said, kneeling to touch the deep red petals. "I wanted to," Damien said. "Every flower that does not wilt deserves a place where it can finally grow in the light." She rose and stood beside him, no longer hiding behind a cap or a borrowed coat, no longer flinching at the sound of her own name spoken aloud. Ferrox grazed peacefully in the paddock beyond the garden wall, calm and whole, answering now to nothing more than the sound of her footsteps. Damien turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his, the same hands that had once trembled around a broken decanter, now steady, sure of themselves at last. "I did not fall for a disguise, Wren. I fell for the woman who stepped in front of a pistol for an animal everyone else had given up on, who kept every promise she made even when keeping it cost her everything. Titles and gowns were never what convinced me. You did that the very first morning, in the mud, before I even knew your name." Wren felt the last of her old guard fall away, the one she had carried so long it had become part of how she stood, how she spoke, how she loved. "Then let me tell you my name properly," she said, her voice steady and unafraid. "I am Wren Calloway, daughter of Colonel Edmund Calloway, and I intend to spend the rest of my life exactly where I am standing, if you will have me." "Always," Damien said, and this time, neither of them looked away. News of Reginald Vane's downfall traveled through the kingdom faster than any royal announcement could have managed on its own. And in the weeks that followed, other families quietly came forward with stories of their own dealings with him. Debts forgiven suspiciously fast, land sold under pressure no one had dared question at the time. The king ordered a wider inquiry into his affairs, and Ashmere Hall, once burdened by the very debts Vane had used to control it, found itself instead thanked publicly for exposing a corruption that had reached further than anyone first realized. Their wedding took place the following spring, not in the grand cathedral favored by families eager to display their wealth, but in the very garden where the amaranth flowers had first bloomed, surrounded only by the people who had earned a place in their lives through loyalty rather than obligation. Ferrox stood saddled and calm beside the garden gate throughout the ceremony, decorated with a simple ribbon the same deep red as the flowers along the wall, and when the vows were spoken, He was the first, before any guest, to press his great head gently against Wren's shoulder in quiet celebration. The Northern Territories, restored fully to the Calloway name, were placed under Wren's direct stewardship, and she spent the following years rebuilding what had been stolen, not with bitterness, but with the same steady patience she had once used to calm a terrified horse in a muddy stable yard. She trained young grooms herself, teaching them the same lesson her father had once taught her, that trust between a creature and its handler cannot be forced, only earned, one honest moment at a time. Damien often said that watching her work reminded him why he had fallen for her in the first place, long before either of them understood what that feeling was. Somewhere in that quiet garden, between two people who had both lost everything and found their way back through grief, suspicion, and one whispered word, a new kind of trust took root, the kind that does not depend on titles or fortune, only on two people choosing honesty over fear, again and again, for as long as it takes to heal. If there is one thing this story leaves behind, let it be this: the truth may stay buried for a long time, but it does not stay buried forever, and the people who hold on to honesty, even when it costs them everything, are usually the ones left standing when the dust finally settles. Titles can be stripped away, fortunes can be stolen and restored, but a single honest word, spoken at exactly the right moment, can undo years of carefully built lies, and it can also build something far sturdier in their place. Subscribe to see how their story continues to unfold, and drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from tonight. I would love to say hello to you personally, just to know how far this story has traveled, and how far we will go together from here.